Hello, I'm Marcia Ivy, Senior Biostatistician at the Caribbean Epidemiology Center, commonly known as CAREC. The focus of this educational series is the completion of the Medical Certificate of Death, a very important medical document both for social and public health needs. Unfortunately, the public health use of the certificates is unknown to many of our physicians. This is evident by the way in which the medical certificates of death are completed.
I'm Dr. Paul Ricketts, General Practitioner and National Epidemiologist in Dominica. It's a sad but undeniable fact that despite the best medical care, people die. As physicians, we are often required to certify the causes of death by recording it on a medical certificate of death. Our role as public health practitioners is to promote health and to prevent illness or death from preventable diseases. Just as a physician must obtain a medical history and assess signs and symptoms of his or her patient, public health practitioners must assess the state of health of the population and advise on resource allocation to different health programs. This is done using different sources of public health data, and a key one being mortality records. Therefore, accurate cause of death information is very important, and if incorrect or incomplete information is recorded on death certificates, then interpretations will be misleading and the interventions inappropriate and ineffective.
The Medical Certificate of Death is the one public health instrument that routinely collects disease-related information. First of all, we see that medical certificates of death serve social as well as statistical functions. On the social side, the certificate is used to obtain legal documents for burial of the deceased, for claiming life insurance, and processing the deceased's will. For the information of the certificate to become public health information, it must go through a classification process. After a death is registered, the certificate is forwarded to the Government Health Information Unit or Central Statistical Office, depending on your country. Here, the different conditions listed on the certificate are coded using an index listing prepared by the World Health Organization's International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems, ICD-10. After all conditions have been coded, special rules prescribed in the ICD-10 manual are used to select the underlying cause of death. This is a standardized process that allows us to compare data between regions within a country and between different countries. Thus, the condition thought to have initiated the morbid events which led to death has gone from being a series of words on a certificate to being specific codes which can be used for statistical summaries. So, mortality data is actually the coded information from medical certificates of death which have been put together and summarized for a group or population. These data can then be used for public health purposes. For example, to assess general health of the population, identify leading causes of death, identify problems prevalent among select members of a population, or to determine the potential years of life lost when persons die from certain conditions. The data also provides evidence for the allocation of resources to health programs, such as health education programs, primary interventions like the introduction of new vaccines into the public sector, training of medical staff, purchasing of hospital equipment and pharmaceuticals, and for research. This video explains how a medical certificate of death should be completed and highlights some of the common problems seen. You don't look so good. What happened?
The patient in 201 has just died. And Dr. Harcourt wants me to complete a death certificate.
So why do you look so perplexed?
Well, I only did this once in medical school. We didn't spend much time on it, so I'm not really sure what to do.
It's not that difficult. With the 3 or 4 deaths we've had recently, I've had to do a couple. So I can help you with that if you want. All right? Name?
That part I can fill out. It's the part about what he died from is what I have a problem with.
Hey, nobody killed him, so he died of natural causes.
Okay, natural causes.
Hello, hang on. He was an old man, almost 60. It was about time for him to die.
Then I'll put old age.
Well, his heart stopped beating.
So I could say cardiac arrest.
But you could say that he stopped breathing.
Okay, what you put is respiratory arrest. I've been using that one quite a bit lately.
Actually, what I've been using recently is cardiorespiratory arrest. It has a nice scientific ring to it.
Hey, I think I like that one. So cardiorespiratory arrest it is.
As amusing as this scenario may seem, it does contain an element of reality. We who work in statistics have seen certificates completed by medical practitioners with precisely these causes. Now let's see how this affects the users of the data.
Good morning, Joanne.
Good morning, Dr. Jones.
How are you this morning?
I'm fine, thank you. You're here to see the CMO?
Yes, I have a 9 a.m. appointment.
Please have a seat. I'll see if he's ready to see you.
Good morning, Elizabeth.
Good morning, Dr. Reed.
Come in, come in. Have a seat.
Thank you.
I really appreciate you answering my email so quickly.
Well, certainly, Dr. Reed. Your email was a little bit vague, but it sounded like it was very important.
Now, the reason why I was so vague in the email, because what I have to tell you is a little bit delicate. You see, the Minister of Health called me yesterday to tell me that the Minister of Works is trying to avert a potential strike at the Boynton rubber plant. You see, the union states that people are getting sick. They even blame some of the deaths over the past year or so on the work environment.
Really? Do they have any proof of this, though?
Well, the minister needs us to investigate these claims to see if there's any truth behind it. And he, along with the Minister of Works, will carry concrete information to the next cabinet meeting.
I see.
And that's where you come in. I'd like you and Ms. Blackwell from the Health Information Unit to gather data on these deaths.
Okay, you mean data like the number of deaths since the plant opened?
That's correct, but also from the previous years. So we can compare them to see if there was really an increase in the number of deaths.
Okay, well, that shouldn't be a problem since they implemented the National Health Information System at the unit.
Precisely.
Okay, well, I also recommend that we look at the underlying causes of death for the 2 periods to see if there have been any changes.
Beautiful. And then we can take that information and compare it to the national data to see if this population is different from any other part of the country.
Okay, well, that sounds straightforward enough. Hello, Dr. Reed. Yes, I'm just going over the data I got from Ms. Blackwell on the deaths in Boynton District. I have to say it has me a little confused. Well, you see, the data shows that there have been more deaths in the last 5 years than there were in the previous years. But the leading causes of death listed are actually cardiovascular arrest and respiratory arrest. Yes, I am sure that this is correct. I was there with Ms. Blackwell when she ran the query on the new mortality database. I know, she agrees that it's not very meaningful at all, but she says that that's what they actually code from the real, actual certificates of death. Yes, 4 o'clock is fine. Yes, that will give me enough time to, actually pull some of the workers' records from the hospital. Okay, thank you, Dr. Reed. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.
So we can see, despite having access to mortality data, the epidemiologist still faces the problem of not being able to explain the increased deaths in the district, much less explain the likely cause. Let's see what the problems are.
Ms. Blackwell, I really appreciate you being here on such short notice. And I trust that Dr. Jones has kept you abreast of what we've been doing.
Yes, Dr. Reed. And as she asked, I pulled our copies of the medical certificates of death for the Boynton plant workers.
Wonderful. And Elizabeth, were you able to get some of the medical records from the General Hospital?
Yes, I was able to get records for workers who died in the last year or so.
Good. So now we can figure out what's really going on. We know that there's an increase in deaths in that area, But we don't know exactly why, right?
Exactly, because the leading causes of death listed are inconclusive. They are more modes of death rather than causes of death.
And that's why I'm glad you're here, Miss Blackwell. How is it we have such a fancy computerized system and we are getting meaningless information from it?
That is a good question. And the answer is actually quite simple. What you saw from the computer is what we get from the death certificates.
But how could this be?
Well, what I think happens is that these certificates are being filled out without the realization of how the information would be used. And I really don't think much effort goes into filling out these certificates properly. That is a constant complaint in my unit.
Okay, let's take a look at some of those certificates. I want you to go through slowly the process so that Dr. Jones and I could really appreciate your problems down there.
All right. Okay, take a look at this. This is the certificate of a 78-year-old man who died last week. The doctor has put down cardiorespiratory arrest as the immediate cause of death and old age as the underlying cause. When we code this certificate as is, the information is meaningless, like what you saw on the computer.
So what should have been put on this certificate?
Well, while waiting, Dr. Jones and I reviewed his medical record. And this gives us a history of, arteriosclerotic heart disease, which was diagnosed 7 years ago after he complained of chest pains. 5 years ago, he had a myocardial infarction and was apparently doing quite well until the chest pains returned 2 weeks ago. 2 days ago, he was readmitted for worsening chest pains, but died within 1 hour of admission from a coronary embolism. He also had a 10-year history of hypertension, but that seemed to have been controlled. So using the coding rules, you would realize that...
Before we go any further, why don't we explain the coding rules in a little bit more detail so that Dr. Reed can understand exactly what the problem is?
Certainly. The coding rules I'm referring to are the ones used to assign codes to the causes of death as listed on a medical death certificate. I'm sure you've heard of the ICD-10, the International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems, which was developed by the World Health Organization. This was designed specifically for classifying causes of death so that statistics can be compiled and data used just as you tried to do.
Okay. Show us how a death certificate should be completed.
Right. Now, this section deals with the causes of death. There are 2 parts. Part 1 deals with a chain of events that lead directly to death, whereas Part 2 deals with other significant conditions that contribute to death. And this side is where the doctor should write the length of time that the patient suffered from the disease or the condition. So for this particular gentleman, the doctor perhaps should have recorded the coronary embolism on line A as the immediate cause of death. Writing cardiorespiratory arrest is incorrect. That is a mode of death, not a cause. I mean, after all, his heart must stop beating for him to die. But that is not a cause of death.
All right.
Right?
Very true. Very true.
In line B, they could have recorded the condition that gave rise to the coronary embolism. Then on the next line, enter the condition that gave rise to what he entered on line B, always asking what gave rise to the condition on the line above.
So then, they should have entered myocardial infarction on line B.
And the final thing on this section of the certificate should have been the underlying cause of death. That is the disease or injury that started the chain of events which led directly to death, which for this man may have been the arteriosclerotic heart disease.
Okay, this makes sense. I myself haven't filled in one of these death certificates in a long time, and I don't recall what I entered. Yeah.
And in this section, the doctor should have recorded the time between onset of each condition and death. So for line A, he had the coronary embolism for a few minutes. He had the infarction 5 years, that would go here, and the heart disease 7 years.
But what about the history of hypertension?
Well, if the doctor felt that hypertension also contributed to his death, then it should be written in part 2. You see, this is the section for other significant conditions that contributed but did not lead to the underlying cause of death.
It really makes sense, eh? I remember some of this, but it was only glossed over in medical school.
The first section of the death certificate deals with the demographic information of the deceased. This allows us to describe the persons who have died according to their age, gender, occupation, place of residence, and so on. The second section carries the critical information on the particulars of death, while the third section carries the information on you, the practitioner certifying the death.
Now, the question is, what should be entered in the cause of death section of the medical certificate of death? This should be all diseases, conditions, or injuries that resulted in or contributed to death, and in the cases of deaths due to accidents or violence, the circumstances which produce the fatal injury.
In Part 1 of the Cause of Death section, the disease or condition on line A should be the one that directly led to death. There must always be an entry on line A. This condition can sometimes be the only condition reported in Part 1, provided it was not due to or did not arise as a consequence of any disease or injury that occurred before the direct cause of death. If the direct cause of death on line A was due to or arose as a consequence of another disease, this disease should be entered on line B. If the condition entered on line B was itself due to another condition or disease, this other condition should be reported on line C, and so on. The last condition entered in this section is considered the underlying cause of death.
A condition should be regarded as being antecedent, not only in an etiological or pathological sense, but also where it is believed that this condition paved the way for the immediate cause by damaging tissues and impairing organ function, even after a long interval.
After completing Part 1, the certifier must consider whether there were any other significant conditions that contributed to but did not lead to the fatal outcome. If so, these conditions should be entered in Part 2. The duration between the onset of each condition and time of death should be entered on each line of the certificate in the column provided. Where the time or date of onset is unknown, the best estimate should be made. The unit of time should also be entered in each case. For example, hours, days, months, or years. This section provides a useful check on sequence of causes. It also helps in the correct assignment of ICD codes and provides valuable information on duration of illness in certain diseases where the natural history of disease progression is being studied.
What I want to know is, why aren't we getting the information from the computer?
Well, as I said earlier, Dr. Reed, the quality of data on the computer depends on what we get from the certificates. You see, when coding, we face several issues. For example, there are errors in coding simply because we cannot read the doctor's handwriting. Take a look at this. I can barely make out the first two lines, but no one can understand what is written on the third line. Here, you try.
Okay. All right, let's go. Cardiorespiratory distress. That's second line. That was the first line. Second line now says seizure activity. That's easy now. Third line,